Hi, everybody. I'm Candid Frank Sinisian. Thank you for joining us here on Open Forum. Welcome to the Spanglish World Network on Zingo TV, channel 250. Please remember to download the Zingo TV app at the respective app stores for iOS and Android devices. While you download, make sure you rate and leave a comment. Both apps are absolutely free. Zingo TV is available on Google Chromecast, Amazon Fire, Fire TV sticks, Roku sticks, and also on all smart TVs 2016 forward. Now, joining me on the program are I'll call them two intellectuals, two writers, talking about a subject that may seem fresh, but from what I understand from our first guest, Paul Summerville, it's something that he's been researching and thinking about writing for 30 years. And then he worked together with Eric Protzer, and they came up with a book, and it has to do with reclaiming populism. I didn't know it needed reclaiming, but okay. Um, First of all, I guess the name of the book says Reclaiming Populism. In what sense are we talking about reclaiming populism?
Certainly. So it's the idea that populism, these forces that we see behind Trump and Brexit and Marine Le Pen are driven by real structural economic unfairness. And that in order to address that, you can't just hope it's going to go away. You can't just try to defeat it. You actually have to address those people's real problems, and you have to try and win back that vote for the political mainstream.
Okay. Would you like to carry on and give us, as best you can, as willing as you are, a synopsis of the book, and then we can discuss, the points that come up, and we can expand on. Then we can get into the weeds, if you will.
Yeah, absolutely. So, Paul and I started working on this book about 3 years ago when we were observing all these populist outbreaks in places, like the US and the UK and France, places that are, of course, cultural cousins to our home country of Canada. And, there was some discussion about, well, why is it happening in these places? And we felt that a lot of the explanations out there didn't necessarily make all that much sense under scrutiny. And so we wrote this book, and it has a more original take. A lot of what you hear, it's all about inequality, it's all about immigration, that kind of thing. Our book argues that the populist movements, the real eruptions around the world today, are driven by economic unfairness. It's the sense that opportunity is not equal and reward is not according to contribution. It results in a system where success is the result of family origins and elite machinations rather than talent and effort, as it fairly should be. And the consequence is that people feel like the system is rigged, and so they want to replace it with something else. So our book analyzes why that's the case, and it offers some policy prescriptions on how you can rebuild a fairer society if you're in the driving seat of government.
Paul, you want to offer your summary of the book?
Yeah, I mean, so you'd mentioned I've been thinking about it for 30 years. I was in Japan. I finished a PhD in 1988, and I joined global finance. Did very well, and I don't know, 5 or 6 years in, I became very wealthy. And why? How did I manage to do this? I grew up in Scarborough, Ontario. Neither of my parents graduated from high school. And sure, I worked hard and I got up early and I did all that kind of stuff. But the truth is that Canada really gave me the opportunity to be successful. Pretty good, not a great education, but a good enough education, for the late 70s, early 80s. Healthcare, public transit, that kind of thing. And it was pretty clear to me that it was a combination of, for the lack of a better expression, equal opportunity, where I was given the tools I needed to increasingly live life on my own terms, protected by the law against discrimination, but also at the same time that Canada had efficient markets, that allowed people to get ahead. And so I always had that in the back of my head, and thought about writing a book that combined what we call in the book the twin virtues of equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. That you need both of these things to have a successful society. And I lived a couple of years in the United States, and it was absolutely clear to me there's an enormous difference between Canada and the US. And in the United States, the middle class lives over a trap door that can be triggered by an accident, ill health, or unemployment. That's not the case in Canada. There's no such thing as the American dream anymore. If there's anything, there's a Canadian dream. Canadians can get ahead, Americans can't. And so I actually tried to write the book a couple of times in 2009 and then again in 2014, and it was kind of mushy. And quite frankly, it was like a lot of the stuff when Eric and I did a literature review in the first half of 2019 to get ready to write the book. It was a lot like that. It didn't really have a economic, quantitative discipline about what was going on. And layering on top of that, as Eric mentioned, was the reality of Brexit, which I lived in. I was actually in the UK. I voted Remain. The Trump event, and of course everything that was going on in other places like in Eastern Europe. So when Eric told me that he was graduating from MIT with his master's degree and moving on and joining the Harvard Growth Lab, I thought this would be a really good twinning of two different kind of skill sets. And Eric, in the fall of 2019, wrote a paper that's been now widely cited, or well cited, I suppose, that showed very clearly that low social mobility is the necessary condition for populism. And by low social mobility, we mean that's a way to talk about economic unfairness, which Eric will build on in a second. And so that there's something very special about the populist result, and that has a lot to do with economic unfairness, and everything else amplifies it.
All right, so if I can, I guess there's a lot to unpack here, gentlemen. What you've done, I have to be honest. It's brilliant what you've come up with. I'll use two words here, and then you can speak to it. Class structure. It is one of the reasons why populism is so popular.
Well, I would say that class structure, it can be part and parcel of the problem of economic unfairness, a situation of low social mobility where people are stuck in their classes. I mean, that's sort of what low social mobility almost is by definition. It's that if you're born into a disadvantaged family for whatever reason, you don't have the tools through things like equal opportunity, relevant things like education or healthcare, and you don't have competitive markets. It means you don't have the tools to get ahead in life. So in a situation of low social mobility, you're absolutely right that class structure becomes entrenched. It becomes this perception of the elites that are setting all the rules for their own benefit. And meanwhile, the regular people, the working class and middle class people are trying to get ahead, but they don't have paths to opportunity. And it's no wonder that people think the system is rigged. And you can quantify that with low social mobility. And you can show that in places, especially like the US and even the UK, that it's very hard to get ahead if you come from that kind of a background. And it's awful.
So yeah, when we constructed the book, the first chapter of the book essentially dismantles all of the competing arguments for what causes populism. And it was one of the reasons we wanted to write it, because there was this kaleidoscope of reasons. And anybody could pull anything out of the air. It's immigration, it's social media use, it's China trade, any number of explanations. And Eric, with his quantitative work, was able to demonstrate that none of those explanations work, particularly income inequality, which we'll talk about a little bit later, and why it's so important to, in a way, freeze that argument out and demonstrate that it's wrong. And it's wrong because it has such huge policy implications. Then in the second and third chapters, what we do, and I'll let Eric expand on this, in the second chapter, we discuss the importance of fairness for high-income countries, that if you don't have fairness, you don't have trust. If you don't have that, then it's very difficult to build highly complex economies and communities. And then in the third chapter, we showed very clearly that economic unfairness and low social mobility was the necessary condition for populism, and that all other explanations were simply amplifiers.
Yeah, I liked your analogy of the trap door. I'll add something else. What is the problem that I'm hearing is it's not just that the middle class have a trap door on the floor they're on. There are no stairs to go upstairs, and so you're locked into that position, or you drop. I think that's the impression I'm getting from what I've heard from you guys so far.
Yeah, that's right, and I think it's really important to contrast that, as Paul highlighted, with simply measures like income and wealth inequality. You know, there have been a lot of left wing figures that have tried to attack the problem of populism from a very redistributionist perspective, and often they've imploded. I mean, you can think of how Jeremy Corbyn was deeply unpopular in the UK. The Red Wall came down and people switched from Labour to the Conservatives. You can think of the fact that the French left, amazingly today, is almost dead. And you can even think of the deep unpopularity of perceptions of socialism from the left flank of the Democratic Party. And it's really interesting because people do tend to, in the popular discussion, emphasize this inequality, but it's not really reducing inequality and aggressive redistribution that people want, because the key thing is that people don't want to eliminate the possibility of success. They want to have a chance at success. That's what low social mobility and economic unfairness captures. It's not a question of simply whether outcomes are equal or unequal. It's, do people have paths to opportunity?
Yeah,
When
and
we
go ahead.
when we first started to map out the book, we were looking for a title. I can still remember the day when we first thought about the title. I lived in Japan for 15 years, and there's a wonderful book on post-war Japan called "Embracing Defeat" by an author called John Dower. It's a wonderful book, not as quite as good as ours. Read ours first, but John Dower's book is a wonderful book about embracing defeat. So we wanted like a verb, that captured. And originally, the title of the book was "Defeating Populism." We've kind of gone in with this prejudice, if you will, that the populist complaint was illogical, perhaps, or not worthy of paying much attention. We very quickly changed our view on that, and the way Eric phrased it was that we needed to take it seriously. We needed to take the populist complaint seriously, and we needed to understand them precisely. We actually went ahead and wrote our book proposal with our publishers, Polity Books, and the contributing editor, George Orwers, who was fabulous, many great suggestions. But he came back and said, I don't think you're talking about defeating populism. I think you're talking about something like reclaiming it. So we right away changed the title.
Yeah, the reclaiming part is that it's a convoluted thing. Populism is also something that can be manipulated, and I think that's one of the inferences that I get from what I've heard from you and doing a little bit of research on you, is that people can take what appears to be a populistic stance when in fact they're doing something else.
Yeah, absolutely, and importantly, it also means that the kind of frustrations that lead to populism and lead to potentially illiberal directions, like we've seen, with Donald Trump and January 6th and everything like that, they don't necessarily have to go in that direction. If you actually take seriously the concerns that people have and you try to really address those, you can do that from the political mainstream, and you can be very constructive in that way. And it's ultimately tragic that there hasn't been a greater emphasis on, addressing these concerns when people feel that they have been unfairly treated.
And
Yeah,
it's probably because, as there's been a misunderstanding of what the problem is. And because there's been so much focus on social justice, intersectionality, and income inequality, political parties that might otherwise have been able to figure this out and end up with the right set of policies came up with a very wrong analysis of what was going on, and therefore the wrong policy prescription. And so one of the things that we argue is that illiberal politicians can amplify the discontent that exists, and that discontent is absolutely vital to the populist problem because it's deep. It's been around for a long time. It affects a lot of people. But the smart politician can amplify using immigration or don't like the Chinese or whatever it is, intergenerational issues, blame social media, when in fact there's something more fundamental at work.
Yeah, that's the new term in politics, especially under the Trump regime, was dog whistles. Saying things that trigger people's emotions, right? And populism can be, I'll call it hijacked, because if we're talking about, it's almost like we're having the communism discussion, right? And I don't mean to confuse the two, right? I'm just saying that the intent of communism is good, but because of the way it operates, it gets derailed. Populism, in essence, can have the same, be affected the same way, that the good of it can be interfered with. Yes.
Well, I think I would say right off the top, there's nothing good about communism.
No, I'm talking about the intent, not the way it plays out. Right? Intent is one thing.
I get what you're saying, though, that even if you have good intentions, it can get derailed into something else. I mean, I agree with Paul. I don't think that that communism can ever be executed successfully. But with regard to populism, you're absolutely right. I mean, there was a great series of interviews that The Economist did a couple of years ago, where they were looking at populist voters in East Germany. The kinds of people voting for Alternative für Deutschland. And what they found from these people overwhelmingly was that they don't like being called racist. They feel like they're not racist. And really their core concern was that they felt left behind, and they saw these newcomers being held first. And it's easy to imagine how, if you are an illiberal populist politician, you can play on that and you can stir up the xenophobic element of it. When, the core of the problem is just that these people are being felt, they feel like they've been left behind and unfairly treated. So there are different ways of attacking the core concerns, and there's not enough of a constructive approach from the mainstream, sadly.
Well, even there's it's kind of fashionable. At least I don't think people say they're communist, but they might say they're socialist. And Thomas Piketty, the famous socialist, Eric was actually in Paris giving a presentation to the institute that he runs, the World Inequality Lab, in early November. The problem is that people think that what socialism is talking about is equal opportunity, when in fact, if you really look at it, it's more of a conversation about equalizing outcomes. Mm-hmm. And our argument is that that's absolutely disastrous for social mobility. Anywhere you've tried to equalize outcomes, you've ended up with unitary state. You've ended up with not only really bad cars, but millions of people being murdered and imprisoned. So the problem right now around this conversation around populism and how the left would like to respond to it, or even the center left, is conflating, saying that equal opportunities and equal outcomes are the same thing. They're not, right? Mm-hmm. Equal opportunity is having the tools in order to live your life as much as possible on your own means. When you have a society like that, any understanding of the human condition will result in completely different, very diverse outcomes, some very good and some very bad. And that's a good thing. That's what you want. You want societies that produce those kind of outcomes. The challenge is then, how does the political system manage those outcomes in such a way that the cycle can begin again, so that the next generation has the chance, as you said, not only not to live over a trap door, but to start to see that there's actually a ladder in front of them. And there's a group of countries where that isn't the case anymore. It's not the case in the United States, not the case in the UK, it's not the case in France, it's not the case in Italy, and all of those places are having big issues with populism. It remains the case with Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and the Nordic countries. That's not to say that that might change, that may not change, but the fact is that there's countries where you can get ahead, and there's countries where you can't.
Yeah, the point I was trying to make about communism is the intention is to have everybody be happy and be equal, but there never is a situation. There never is. There
what
never
a terrible
is.
Idea! Oh,
no. No, hang on.
I don't think Marx had. If you actually read it, I'm not sure even Marx was that thick. But it's just the way that that's what happened because of the reality that what socialism talks about is a completely different economic architecture than what markets is, and particularly in terms of private property. So we don't want to go too far off on that.
All I'm talking about is outcomes. There's a
intent versus outcomes.
It's about the outcomes. Right. I was trying to make the point of the only similarity that I was trying to put between populism and communism, and you can even say socialism, is that the rules are what dictate how you end up. The inferences don't count. That's the problem with all three. You state and you give messages to people, and then they get an inference from what you're trying to say. The bottom line that I want to make sure I understand that your point is, it's not just about opportunity. It's about turning that opportunity into success.
Yes.
in a fair and equitable manner. In
Exactly.
other words, effort becomes, to put it bluntly, effort becomes financial gain.
Yes.
There's a direct connection between the two.
That's
Yeah.
right.
Whereas with populism, there's an interference. We witnessed it with Donald Trump. Communism, you don't have to look long. I agree with you, Paul. I was in no way trying to defend communism.
Sorry.
Socialism to me is the only way it'll work is if we limit it to the social safety net, because I
Right.
Well,
think
then it's not socialism. So
right. So
right.
but that's I'm just saying that's
Mhm.
I'm giving you my belief when I say socialism.
Right.
That's what I think it should be.
Sure.
Whether it is or whether it isn't, I'm not that smart to figure it all out.
Right.
That's
It
why
isn't.
you guys are here.
It isn't. Well, let's go back and just talk about the word populism for a second, because we're talking about reclaiming populism. And really, what we're talking about is reclaiming the populist complaint, the core complaint, right? The core complaint that I can't get ahead, right? That if I get sick, I'm going to lose my job, I'm going to lose my house. That if I'm really smart and I work hard, like in France and Italy, the markets are set up in such a way that I can't get ahead. That's the core complaint that we're trying to reclaim. And if you reclaim it, if you create a society where people can get ahead, then the amplification opportunity is not going to be there. And obviously, and it may be one of the reasons we're on your show today, is that in the last 2 weeks, Eric and I have been inundated. Our book is not about Canada. We don't really talk about Canada in our book. We've been inundated. The New York Times, the Toronto Star, Steve Paikin, the Agenda, CBC, you name it, to talk about our thesis and asking us, does the occupation of Ottawa and the other protests, is this the thin edge of the wedge of Trumpism? And I'll let Eric answer what we've been saying.
Yeah, sure. So, I mean, again, it's something that lots of people are wondering about, and I don't blame them, because on the one hand, Canada has this great history of moderation, but there's this sudden protest that appears quite scary to a lot of people. So a lot of people are wondering, does this mean that we're heading in the future direction of politics, something more like what happens in the US with Trump? And, Paul and I think that we just don't think it's really possible for it to play out like that. And there are a couple of reasons why. One, and perhaps the most important one, is that the structural reasons behind the Canadian protests that have been happening, the Freedom Convoy, and the factors that led to like Donald Trump and Brexit are so completely different. If you look at the Freedom Convoy, I mean, the main impetus for this is certainly COVID restrictions that have happened over the last 2 years. We didn't have anything like the Freedom Convoy before this. People are acutely angry about these restrictions. And I think, quite honestly, that's why most of the protesters who went out there were out there. They just want to see these COVID restrictions dismantled. So it's a really acute short-term thing almost. But you have to understand that what led to Donald Trump and what led to Brexit and the yellow vest, the Gilets jaunes in France, that results from 30 plus years of structurally entrenched economic unfairness, where people have felt like the system is not meritocratic, where no matter how hard they try or how good ideas they have, they can't get ahead, while they see elites get ahead because they were born in the right family or something like that. So, to compare those two structural forces, it's a very, very different ballgame. The other point of comparison is just the point that it's really questionable whether these Freedom Convoy protests even are populism to begin with. And the reason for that is because one of the core features of populism, as we describe in our book, is anti-pluralism. It's the sense that only my political tribe has the right to make legitimate political decisions. And you can think of really famous examples of that. Things like lock her up, things like the intense xenophobia and racism from the Trump campaign, things like the January 6th Washington, D.C. Capitol riot that literally, essentially was a coup attempt aiming to end a peaceful transfer of power. That's anti-pluralism. And that's just not a feature of being upset about COVID restrictions. It's a very different ballgame.
We would actually say that the Occupy Ottawa moment was more an example of bad policing than it was populism.
Yeah.
Also, how does internationalism, because you've alluded to that a little bit, fit into populism? I'll give you an example, unless you know what I'm asking. But having people donate to the demonstrations in Canada from the U.S.
Yeah, let me just come at it a different way, because I think what's we're always thinking about is, how do you think about fairness? And one of the things we argue in the book is that fairness is a moving target. It's not a static thing. And so how does society become fair or unfair? Well, our societies, and particularly the last 30 years, are undergoing tremendous technological change. And when you have massive technological change, the structure of the economy changes. And you get big winners and you get big losers. This is a very typical feature of modern economies since the 1850s. And the challenge then for the political system is, how does it react to that? How does the change in the structure of the economy play out politically? And the fact is that in the last 30 years, politicians like Tony Blair, Bill Clinton, even Paul Martin here in Canada, they were so persuaded by the neoliberal argument that markets are always right, that there were a lot of things they didn't do when they had the chance to mitigate some of the dislocation that was being created by these new technologies. When you layer on the tremendous change in the last 10 years on top of that, you've almost created a hereditary elite. And there's a lot of literature on this about, who people are marrying and who they're hanging out with, and all the private schools and all this kind of stuff. So the point is that fairness is a moving target. And if it's a moving target, then you've got to be very sensitive to how you react to that change. So when we look historically at populism, the idea of populism became in the political currency in the 1890s. And it was in France and in the United States where the idea of populism came up. And again, the complaints were very fair. There's a whole bunch of people who were disenfranchised. What is interesting about that period of time is that it was the first crisis of globalization, because in the 1890s you had really deep depression. And I always think it wasn't a crisis of globalization. It was a crisis of how the political system managed that crisis. And this is what we have today. Whether our political systems, Canada's doing okay. I think in the book we argue pretty clearly that it's not okay in the United States. The United States doesn't have a political system that's able to manage the current crisis of globalization, with immense consequences, not only for the United States, but potentially for Canada. So when we think about the really, really big picture, we have to think about that technological change changes the structure of the economy, and how does the political system adapt?
Yeah, Eric, the point, I'll try it a different way. How important for populism and its survival and its execution is self-determination within your borders?
Okay, well, I mean, it depends sort of what you mean by self-determination in what respect. I mean, people have political liberties. Yeah, but I mean, so, there's the question not just of political liberties, which of course are absolutely essential, but also self-determination with respect to your economic life. And that's almost a important aspect of economic fairness. It's that if you have a system where people have access to equal opportunity and they have competitive markets, so they can translate that opportunity to tangible success, it means you can live life more on your own terms. You can have a sense of self-determination in your economic life, because if you go after opportunities and you put in the effort and you have fantastic ideas, you can get to the places you want to get.
Yeah.
Let me go at it this way, because it is actually a really fundamental question. I would just ask it more as maybe as a political scientist might ask it.
Go ahead.
Yeah. So the question is, particularly if you're trapped in one paradigm, like if you're American or if you're British or whatever, we have to do something. We have to overturn the system. We have to get rid of markets. We have to get rid of capitalism. The market system doesn't work. What we would say is, if you actually look at where populism happens and where it doesn't happen, that each individual country has its own way of doing things. It's got its own political system. It's got its own history. It's got its own culture. It's got its own economic structure. So every country has its own set of challenges and tools. And we talk a lot about this in chapter 5, something that Eric will touch on. So the point about capitalism is that it's what you make of it So Canada has a Canadian capitalism. There's an American capitalism. There's a Danish capitalism. There's a lot of similarities, but there's a lot of things that are different. And there are deeply embedded cultural and social mores in those different national capitalisms that makes it possible or impossible to have high social mobility. And this is the work that Eric does for his livelihood.
Tell us about chapter 5.
Yeah, sure. So, well, I suppose it's necessary to twin chapters 4 and 5 together to an extent, and that's the element of the book that is really addressed at the solutions. You know, if you buy the idea that low social mobility and economic unfairness is the problem, how do you fix that? As we've emphasized, it's not through redistribution, it's through pinning equal opportunity with fair, unequal outcomes. But importantly, if you're a policymaker, you need to consider that there are so many different things that could support equal opportunity and fair, unequal outcomes. You know, things that, for example, go into equal opportunity include not just education, but healthcare, unemployment insurance, freedom from discrimination, even arguably financial legislation to, prevent the possibility of a financial crisis. And if you're a policymaker faced with this wide range of possible reforms, you've got to ask, well, where are you going to put your priorities? Because if you just do a scatter shot and you try to do a little bit of everything, you might miss the things you're doing worst at, and you might miss the biggest problems that are most holding you back. So we use something called the diagnostic method in chapter 5. It's a little bit detailed, but the idea of it is that you can identify which inputs are the most painful. And you can do that in a very quantitative way, looking for evidence that things are in high demand and low supply, so that if you expand that supply, it would create a large payoff. You can imagine that, for example, in the case of, say, regional infrastructure in the UK, there's a lot of evidence that regional infrastructure in the UK outside of London has been really underinvested in. And it's been a huge feature of the leveling up debate in the UK for good reasons. And it means that people have trouble competing. And there's good evidence that that's really highly demanded as well. If you look at firm surveys of investors that are going in and considering whether to invest and boost the economy in these regions, they say that the lack of infrastructure is their number one issue. So you look for that kind of evidence to see what is the specific problem that is the biggest thing that holds back a fairer, more socially mobile economy in my particular country or region.
And just to put on my political science hat for a second, another way of asking Frank's question is the structure of global capitalism so rigid that smaller countries like Canada and others really can't determine their own economic future. This was something called dependency theory in the 1970s and 80s. It was very popular with the left. All the evidence, of course, is that's not true. I mean, it's an important question to ask. But the fact is, because we get such different social mobility outcomes in smaller countries, like Australia, like Canada, like New Zealand, like the Nordics, domestic policymakers have enough power in their own hands to go a long way to shaping the economic future of their citizens.
We do. We're up to chapter 6. All right, and I wonder if you want go on to chapter 6. I've asked my question.
There's 5 chapters and a
Oh, there's 5. Okay.
Yes.
I don't have the book, so
no worries.
no. So I guess we can get to this
book.
point.
You should get it. It's available on Kindle.
Sale made. Apparently, Eduardo and I are going to have a copy. Don't worry about it. We definitely will. I look at this, and I guess the reason I want you to know that I would like to share with you the fact that I come from a construction management background, sports, television, decades of that stuff, and basically, I'm not a political scientist, but I am a guy who worked with his hands, and what I do know is that essentially for those that are along my same lines is what we're talking about here is the promotion of populism is the idea that it's like piecework. The more you do, the more you accomplish, the more you earn. when we were talking about communism, whether you create 5 or 6 widgets
Doesn't matter.
or one, you all get the same money. That
Right,
sucks. I'll be the
right.
first. I'm the first person to suggest that. It's about free competition, free opportunity to an end that is not equal but justified. If I can use a different word, right?
Yeah.
Absolutely, that's the right word.
Right. So for me, I don't understand, how populism cannot be used. What do you see as one of the handicaps or one of the drags on populism being a good thing? And as I said before, not being hijacked a little.
Yeah, well, I mean, I think the main problem comes from the lack of understanding and even the rejection of people who have these kind of concerns from the political mainstream. There's maybe 2 categories of problem. One, which is the most serious, is just rejecting these people and calling them deplorables and stupid and racist and saying, if you're having these kinds of complaints, it's like those voters in East Germany. They don't like being called racist. They just don't like it when they see funds for newcomers when they feel left behind. And if you just dismiss those people, you're never going to actually be able to speak to them. You're never going to probably be able to even really solve the problem because you're just not paying attention to it. So that's one major reason why people get pushed into a more liberal direction like Trump. And we saw that with the deplorables quote from Hillary in 2016. The other reason is that people might think that there's an issue there, but then they misunderstand what it is completely. And that's the classic problem you see from people like Jeremy Corbyn and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. They think that okay, maybe there's something going wrong with the economy, but in their view, the solution is just to equalize things. And of course, voters have completely rejected that. It hasn't played out well. And, there's all the behavioral science evidence that people really care a lot more about fairness and meritocracy than equalized outcomes to begin with. So it's a combination of not even taking them seriously. And then, the few that do take them seriously think it's a completely different problem that is actually antithetical to fairness. So there's a need to really understand that this is a real problem, and that what you have to do to take it seriously is tackle that unfairness.
You want to add something to that, Paul?
No,
Otherwise, I'll throw something in there to help the conversation that you're alluding to, Eric. It's the same thing as when that phrase came out, which I totally abhorred: defund the police.
Oh, yeah.
You're trying to make a point, so you're using a sledgehammer rather than being more nuanced with the conversation, right?
Yeah.
And sometimes I think that's how populism gets missteered, right? We get away from the bare bones facts, right? What I'm learning from your book, at least from what I'm hearing from you, it's best that we take the time to try to understand rather than jump to conclusions. The problem is getting the understanding is really hard. And I'm glad you've written this book. I'm glad both of you worked on it, that maybe we can get a better understanding of that. And I think we are in a world which you've proven by what you've told us about prior to being on this show, how you're very popular around the TV circuit. Obviously, there's a hunger, whether it's just the media or people in general. I know I'm an ordinary person. I'm more than interested in hearing about populism. So how do you feel? Do you feel billowed about what's going on?
Well, I think you've picked the right word. Yeah, I think there is a hunger for a different way to think about this. And I think what we've said to people is, look, that there's 2 things that you need. People need to be able to have the tools to be successful, and it's not just a couple of things. It's actually quite a lot of things. Social mobility and economic fairness is not an easy thing to achieve. That's why not a whole bunch of countries have been very good at it. I mean, Canada's quite lucky in a way that it's one of those countries that have achieved that. But the second thing is fair, unequal outcomes. And I think that's the part that people are finding refreshing, because, as Eric said, there's been such a push to equalize outcomes, to think about human beings purely on racial terms, issues around gender, all of that kind of social justice conversation. A lot of it, fair enough, but the fact is, if you want to create high socially mobile, economically fair countries, that stuff you got to put in a box. If you lead with fairness, the famous American philosopher writer Bell Hooks, said that if you lead with fairness and justice, you make a lot of friends. If you lead with race and inequality, you make a lot of enemies.
Yeah, I definitively speaking, unfortunately, again, this goes back to what I said about defund the police. Racism, in the populist framework. I ask you, in the populist framework, racism shouldn't exist, because the whole point of populism, and the point that you're making with with equal fairness, unfortunately there is some unequal fairness, if I can change that word a little bit. I come from the thinking, and I want to know how you guys feel, that there has to be a leveling of the playing field as people enter into, the economy, if you will. I do believe that Black people are having problems in the U.S. and even Canada. We hear about this,
Sure.
but I choose, and you can, if this works better for populism, I choose to state not that Black people should be equal. I choose to say that everyone should be equal. The problem is, and I agree with you, Paul. Do I agree with you a whole bunch? That the more we concentrate on individual groups, we disenfranchise other groups. So sometimes I guess we got to figure out, and in populism, what I'm hearing from you, it sounds good if we stick to that. Don't put any color or race in what we're trying to do. Maybe it becomes more effective. And is that a function of populism?
Yeah, well, I mean, what I would say in response to that is that, I mean, for one, you're absolutely right that certainly is discrimination and unequal opportunity in the world, even in places like Canada, and certainly in places like the US. But, equally, as you pointed out, it's about the way you tackle that. The way, there's a way to tackle that where you divide people and you demonize people, and you just divide them into these different camps and tell them that some are good and some are evil, and that they should hate each other. Some are oppressors and some are victims, and it's not a way to actually make a lot of progress in our view. If you want to actually try to eliminate those problems, there's a much more positive way to do that. And as you said, one of the elements of that certainly is thinking about people not in these little subdivided groups, but in the way that everyone's a human. And in Canada, everybody's a citizen of Canada, and in the US, everyone's a citizen of the US. Trying to think in more universal terms, and what holds back unequal opportunity for wide varieties of people. If you're looking for creating a political platform that speaks to a lot of different categories of people who are being treated unfairly, that kind of universal spread works a lot better. Because the fact is that there are lots of African Americans in the U.S., for example, who feel like they have been treated unfairly. There's also lots of working class white people in the U.S. who have been treated unfairly. And if you want to launch a broad-based campaign, it's important to realize that those people actually have some things in common. They face problems like totally over-the-top expensive access to healthcare and education that causes medical bankruptcy, all these awful problems that you can address in a universalist way and do a big tent approach.
So when we finished the 5 chapters, our contributing editor, George, asked us to write a conclusion, a postscript, a roadmap for mainstream political parties that would help them reclaim the populist vote. To do what? To win back disenchanted voters. I mean, that's the subtitle of the book. I mean, that's what the book's all about. So if you're going to do that, first of all, you should understand what their complaints are. Secondly, you should take them really seriously. And third, you shouldn't call them racist, right?
Agreed.
You should probably lead with fairness. And we were asked on one of the shows we were on this week, if we were thinking forward, what would we recommend? And we'd say lead with fairness. If you're a politician, talk to your potential voters about fairness. Wrap and root your economic and social policies on fairness, and a lot will happen. A lot will follow as a consequence. Even, Frank, in our lifetimes, the extraordinary positive demographic and cultural changes that Canada has gone through, where women are in the place, and infinitely more diverse, welcoming. I always talk about the table getting bigger. When I was, I'm 64, I was graduating from high school in, 1976, it was a pretty small table. Well, in 40 plus years, that table's got a lot bigger. Thank goodness. The international, all-star team is what I call Canada. One of the highest foreign-born proportions of population in the world. So, and how has Canada done that? It's done it mostly by leading with fairness. Are there issues? Sure, all the data shows it. 6% of our population is Indigenous, 50% of our prison population is Indigenous. If you do stop and searches in cities, a much higher percentage than their representation of the population of young Black men are stopped and searched. We know all that stuff. How do you fix it? You fix it by talking about fairness. Think about designing policies that give people the tools they need to live their life on their own terms. And you have competitive markets that are well regulated and well taxed. And you consistently ask yourself, as the economy changes due to technological advancement, what do we have to do to make sure that fairness stays at the center of our public policy?
For me, Eric, the best analogy I can use is that we need to throw away tables that are square and use round tables so that there is no advantage, that we're all equal.
Mm-hmm. Yeah,
economically as well, because that's what your book speaks to. Your book speaks to there is no favoritism. It's equal, opportunity.
Well, we know that, of course, there's no society on earth where everyone's, every kid is starting at the same. I always think about, the 100-yard dash, right?
Right.
We know that there are some kids, and increasingly, in Canada, further up the starting line, right? Instead of maybe, when I was 20, the kids that went to private school, maybe they were starting on around 10 yards ahead of me, right? And maybe there were kids who were 10 yards behind me. I think in the last 20 years, even though Canada's doing pretty well, that gap has grown. And there's some, Miles Korek, for example, a great scholar who looks at this stuff, is, arguing that, the bottom 40% of Canada are more on a treadmill than they are on a ladder. So that's something that Canadians, really, really have to think about.
Yeah, one of the challenges, Eric, that you speak to, and in the book you guys both speak to, I'll give an example, and then you guys work it out. You talk about inherited power. Great examples of that are the last president, Donald Trump, who came from money, and we have Trudeau's son here, Justin Trudeau. He came from the ruling class. How speak to us about that and how that can be adjusted to help with reclaiming populism.
Well, sure. I mean, it's interesting you mentioned that, because there's almost sort of an inherent contradiction about Donald Trump, in that he portrayed himself as this champion of the working class and everything like that. But you're right. He came from a very wealthy and privileged background, and if anything, he perhaps arguably represents exactly the kind of corruption that he was talking about with Drain the Swamp. And ultimately, I think you have to put that in his case just down to the pure spin of it. He even though he came from that kind of a background, the way he talked as if he was, sensitive to these people's issues. But with regard to how this can feed into the larger question of reclaiming populism, I think that in a lot of countries, you absolutely do have to tackle the problem of just inherited success. And part of that is a question about, how do you tax fairly? And it's something that even a lot of countries like Canada sometimes struggle with. For example, one of the major ways in which you have this almost self-perpetuating capital owning class is because the rate of taxation on capital is way lower than the rate of taxation on labor. And, to be really clear, in the book, we talk about how we're not in favor of just soaking the rich. That's not the right approach. It's not just heavy redistribution. But, if you're earning money through capital versus through labor, you should probably pay about the same tax rate on those things. Both are forms of earning your money, and it's not really fair that somebody who's just getting a return on capital is being taxed so much more lightly than somebody who's working, whether a blue collar or a white collar job in an employment position. How
many Canadians know that if you're a couple and you make $85,000 a year on investment income, you pay no tax.
Yeah.
But if you're a couple and you make $85,000 and you're a nurse and you're a plumber, you pay about $35,000. Is that fair? It's
I
not.
think I think Eric, you explained it perfectly, and Paul, you supported it very well. I'll add a word in there that you didn't use that most people will understand. Income is income.
Yeah.
Exactly.
Exactly.
Yeah,
Exactly.
Income is income.
And so that's a consequence. And, most of the government the last 30 years has been liberal. They're supposed to be kind of left of center. And yet, that was something that, Paul Martin was, very much a part of making that happen. And so then the fact is that there's many, many Canadians who have built their retirement plans around that structure. So how do you change it? So, there's lots of issues around that, trusts and, in the UK, for example, you can gift to your children from the day they're born about $5,000 a year. You put $5,000 in their name for their pension, right? And you put $5,000 in their name, and the state adds 20% as soon as you put it in. You've made a 20% income. How many families can afford that? Well, families that have wealth can afford it, and so it's a way of protecting wealth. If you can give all your wealth to your children in the UK, every single penny, a country that has pretty high inheritance taxes, as long as you stay alive for 7 years, they don't pay a penny of inheritance tax, right?
Absolutely. Did
So
you
all
want
those
to throw something in, Eric?
Oh, well, I would I think that Paul has said it pretty well. It's just that it's shocking how little action and attention has been on these kinds of issues. It's just sort of almost accepted as the status quo. It's in some ways a little bit nuts.
Well, I think it speaks to it speaks to the main crux of your book, which is, and I'll put it in plain simples. Being a plain ordinary guy, I'm not a social scientist, but a return for your work, for what you do, a fair return that's not relative to what someone else does. It's relative to how much you contribute, and getting
Exactly.
a fair return for what you do, and I bet you if you ask every kid, every child or of let's say 10, 12 years old, and you ask them, how would you like to live in a world like that? How many of them would you think would say no?
It's funny you mentioned that because we opened the book with this fabulous quote from Lucy Kellaway, who is a former Financial Times journalist, and she was incredibly successful, and she quit her job to go and teach math to working class students in a deprived area of London. And this one day she got, kind of as a result of her former connection to the Financial Times, so she could write about it. She got this opportunity to stay in the most expensive hotel room in all of London. And something that really surprised her was the way the kids reacted, because she thought, these working class kids, most of them or half of them are on breakfast programs. She thought maybe they won't like this idea so much. But in fact, they thought it was fantastic. And there was one kid who even said, if I was Jeff Bezos, I would absolutely do that. And she commented that he seemed like he had absolutely every intention of becoming him one day. So
everyone wants their kids to win the gold medal, and they don't want to cheat, right? Which is what we've just seen in the figure skating and the Olympics. I mean, that's what it's all about, right? Everyone wants their kids to do well. Everyone wants the chance that they can, get one step up the ladder, and that their kids can get up the ladder. And you need to create a society where that's the case. And when you do, I promise you, you will not have populist eruptions like we've had in the UK, the United States, and other places, period.
It's true. Dissatisfaction does drive people to be dissatisfied. There's no way around it. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure.
Thank you.
Thank you for sharing this great book. And you can hold it up again, Paul.
That was coming.
There we go. Reclaiming Populism. Thank you so much.
Go buy it. Our guests have been Paul Summerville and Eric Protzer. Gentlemen, it's been a real pleasure having you on.
Thank you. Likewise. Thank you.
All right, I'm Candid Frank Stanishi. Thank you for watching Candid Frank Live's Open Forum, seen live Fridays at 4 p.m. The show can also be heard on the Spanglish World Radio Network. For Open Forum, other news, entertainment, and sports programming we offer, please check out spanglishworld.ca. Spanglish World. Watch it, hear it, read it, download it, and live it. Thanks for watching, everyone. Live rich if you can, I guess, is the main story.